In the shadowy corridors of American crime, few figures have captured the public imagination quite like Frank Lucas, the smooth-talking drug kingpin from Harlem who claimed to have built an empire that rivaled the Italian mafia itself. Hollywood certainly bought into the legend, crafting a glossy blockbuster that painted Lucas as a criminal mastermind who outsmarted everyone, from corrupt cops to seasoned mobsters. But here's the thing about legends. They're usually built on a foundation that's part truth, part myth, and entirely designed to sell you something. The 2007 film American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas, wasn't just entertainment. It was a carefully constructed narrative that transformed a street-level drug dealer into something approaching folklore. Audiences walked out of theatres believing they'd witnessed the rise and fall of America's most ingenious criminal entrepreneur. The movie painted Lucas as the man who revolutionized heroin trafficking by cutting out the middlemen, importing pure product directly from Southeast Asia in the coffins of dead American soldiers. It's a hell of a story. The only problem? Most of it never happened. What we're about to uncover isn't just another case of Hollywood taking liberties with the truth. This is something far more calculated, a deliberate rewriting of history that elevated a relatively minor player into the starring role of his own criminal fantasy. Frank Lucas didn't just lie to Hollywood, he lied so convincingly and for so long that even seasoned journalists, law enforcement officials, and filmmakers bought into his carefully crafted mythology. But why does this matter? Why should we care whether one drug dealer from the 1970s embellished his resume? Because the Frank Lucas story isn't really about Frank Lucas at all. It's about how we construct heroes out of villains, how we romanticize criminality, and how the most dangerous lies are often the ones that contain just enough truth to seem believable. The real Frank Lucas was certainly a criminal. He dealt drugs in Harlem during the late 1960s and early 1970s. He made money, he corrupted officials, and he caused immeasurable harm to his community. But the empire he claimed to have built, the innovative smuggling operation he supposedly masterminded, the legendary status he achieved in the criminal underworld. That's where reality and fiction begin to diverge in ways that would make even the most creative screenwriter blush. Let's start with the most famous claim, the one that became the centerpiece of the entire American gangster narrative. Lucas insisted that he had developed a direct pipeline from the poppy fields of Southeast Asia to the streets of New York, bypassing traditional mafia-controlled distribution networks. According to his version of events, he was importing heroin so pure it had to be cut multiple times before hitting the streets, selling it under the brand name Blue Magic, and generating profits that dwarfed anything the established crime families had ever seen. The coffin story became particularly legendary. Lucas claimed he had struck a deal with his cousin, a soldier serving in Vietnam, to smuggle heroin back to the United States hidden in the coffins of American servicemen killed in action. It was audacious, it was disrespectful, and it was exactly the kind of detail that made his story irresistible to anyone looking for the ultimate crime narrative. The image of Lucas desecrating the remains of fallen soldiers to fuel his drug empire added a layer of moral outrage that transformed him from simple criminal into something approaching a folk devil. There's just one problem with this compelling narrative. According to virtually every credible law enforcement source, military official, and independent investigation conducted over the decades, it never happened. Not the coffin smuggling, not the direct Asian connection, not the revolutionary distribution network that supposedly made Lucas the kingpin of kingpins. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the agency that actually investigated Lucas and ultimately brought him down, has repeatedly stated that there is no evidence supporting his claims about coffin smuggling or direct importation from Southeast Asia. Military officials have categorically denied that such an operation could have existed given the security protocols surrounding the repatriation of American war dead. Even Lucas's own family members, when pressed by investigators, have admitted they have no knowledge of the elaborate international smuggling operation he described. So if Frank Lucas wasn't the criminal mastermind he claimed to be, who was he really? The answer is both simpler and more mundane than the Hollywood version would have you believe. Lucas was essentially a mid-level drug dealer who operated in Harlem during a time when the heroin trade was exploding across American cities. He wasn't importing directly from Asia, he was buying from the same suppliers that other dealers used. He wasn't running a revolutionary distribution network. He was selling drugs on street corners and through small-scale operations like countless other dealers of his era. But here's where the story gets interesting. Lucas wasn't content to be just another forgotten criminal. Somewhere along the way, he realized that his actual crimes weren't nearly spectacular enough to guarantee him the kind of attention and notoriety he craved, so he began to embellish. Small exaggerations became elaborate fabrications. Minor successes became legendary conquests. A relatively brief criminal career became an epic saga of innovation and empire building. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Lucas spent years refining his narrative, testing different versions of his story on journalists, law enforcement officials, and anyone else willing to listen. He discovered that people wanted to believe in the existence of criminal masterminds, especially ones who could outsmart established power structures. The more outrageous his claims became, the more attention they generated. By the time Hollywood came calling, Lucas had perfected his performance. He wasn't just telling lies, he was telling the kinds of lies that people desperately wanted to believe. The Coffin story wasn't just about drug smuggling, it was about American military corruption and the moral compromises of the Vietnam War era. The direct Asian connection wasn't just about criminal efficiency, it was about entrepreneurial innovation applied to illegal enterprises. The movie industry, always hungry for compelling narratives based on true events, found in Frank Lucas exactly what they were looking for. Here was a criminal whose story seemed to encapsulate everything fascinating about American crime in the 1970s: urban decay, political corruption, racial tension, and the collision between old-school organized crime and new generation hustlers. What makes this deception particularly effective is that Lucas never claimed to be innocent. He readily admitted to dealing drugs, corrupting officials, and engaging in violence. These admissions of actual criminality provided just enough credibility to make his more elaborate fabrications seem plausible. After all, if he was willing to confess to serious crimes, why would he lie about the details? This is where we begin to understand the true genius of Frank Lucas's deception. He wasn't just lying about what he had done, he was creating a mythology that served multiple purposes simultaneously. For Hollywood, it provided an irresistible story of criminal innovation and downfall. For law enforcement officials looking to justify their actions, it created a worthy adversary whose capture seemed genuinely significant. For Lucas himself, it guaranteed a form of immortality that his actual crimes could never have achieved. The consequences of this elaborate fiction extend far beyond the entertainment industry. When we celebrate criminals as innovators and entrepreneurs, when we transform drug dealers into folk heroes, we're not just distorting history, we're contributing to a culture that romanticizes activities that destroy communities, families, and lives. The real Frank Lucas operated in a world that was simultaneously more brutal and more ordinary than the cinematic version suggests. While Hollywood painted him as a criminal visionary who revolutionized the heroin trade, the truth reveals a man whose actual impact was far more limited and whose methods were depressingly conventional. During the height of his alleged power in the early 1970s, Lucas claimed to control a significant portion of Harlem's heroin market through his superior product and innovative distribution methods. He boasted about his Blue Magic brand, describing it as so pure and potent that it dominated the streets and attracted customers from across New York City. According to his version of events, this purity came directly from his exclusive Asian suppliers, making him the envy of every other dealer in the city. The reality was starkly different. Law enforcement records from the period show that Lucas was one of dozens of mid-level dealers operating in Harlem, none of whom had any kind of monopolistic control over the local drug trade. The DEA agents who actually worked the streets during this era consistently report that while Lucas was certainly active in the heroin business, he was never the dominant figure he later claimed to be. More damaging to his legend is the testimony of other criminals from the same period. When investigators began seriously examining Lucas's claims in the 1990s and 2000s, they discovered that virtually none of his contemporaries could corroborate his stories about massive importation operations or revolutionary distribution networks. Fellow dealers, corrupt officials, and even rival criminals who had every reason to acknowledge Lucas's success, if it had actually existed, consistently described him as a competent but unremarkable player in the Harlem drug scene. The Blue Magic brand name itself appears to have been another fabrication. While Lucas claimed this was his signature product that commanded premium prices throughout New York, DEA records contain no references to any heroin brand operating under that name during the relevant time period. Street-level investigations, arrest records, and seized drug evidence from the early 1970s show no trace of the supposedly legendary Blue Magic that Lucas described in such vivid detail. Perhaps even more telling is what happened when Lucas was actually arrested and prosecuted. If he had truly been running the kind of massive operation depicted in American Gangster, his takedown would have created a significant disruption in New York's heroin markets. Major importers and distributors don't disappear without leaving noticeable gaps in supply chains, fluctuations in street prices, or power struggles among competing organizations. None of that happened when Lucas was removed from the streets. The heroin trade in Harlem continued without any apparent disruption, suggesting that whatever role Lucas had actually played was easily replaceable. This stands in stark contrast to the arrests of genuine major figures in organized crime, which typically create measurable impacts on drug availability and pricing in affected markets. The financial evidence is equally problematic for Lucas's mythology. While he claimed to have generated millions of dollars through his drug empire, the assets actually seized by law enforcement tell a much more modest story. His lifestyle, while comfortable by the standards of a street-level dealer, was hardly consistent with the massive wealth he later claimed to have accumulated. When investigators attempted to trace Lucas's alleged financial empire, they found no evidence of the complex money laundering operations, overseas bank accounts, or legitimate business investments that would be expected from someone generating the kind of revenue he described. The paper trail simply wasn't there, and financial crimes investigators are notably skilled at following money, even decades after the fact. The international connections that form the backbone of Lucas's story proved equally illusory. Despite extensive cooperation between American and Southeast Asian law enforcement agencies, no evidence has ever emerged of the sophisticated smuggling network Lucas claimed to have established. Military and customs officials who were responsible for security during the Vietnam War era have consistently stated that the coffin smuggling operation he described would have been virtually impossible given the protocols in place for handling American war dead. More fundamentally, the basic logistics of Lucas's claimed operation don't withstand scrutiny. The heroin trade during the 1970s was dominated by established networks that had been operating for decades, with deep connections to both Asian suppliers and American distribution systems. The idea that a single individual, operating without significant financial backing or institutional support, could have disrupted these established relationships and created an independent pipeline is simply not credible to anyone familiar with how international drug trafficking actually operates. This raises the question of how Lucas managed to convince so many people, including experienced journalists and filmmakers, that his fabricated version of events was true? The answer lies partly in his skills as a storyteller and partly in the cultural moment when his story gained prominence. Lucas understood intuitively that his audience wanted to believe in the existence of criminal masterminds who could outsmart established systems through pure innovation and audacity. His story appealed to deeply held American beliefs about entrepreneurship and individual achievement, even when applied to criminal enterprises. By positioning himself as a self-made businessman who happened to operate outside the law, he tapped into narratives that resonated with both criminal mythology and legitimate business success stories. The timing of his storytelling was also crucial. When Lucas began seriously promoting his mythology in the 1980s and 1990s, most of the law enforcement officials who had actually investigated him in the 1970s were retired or dead. The institutional memory that might have immediately contradicted his claims had largely disappeared, leaving him free to construct his narrative without fear of immediate contradiction from authoritative sources. Additionally, the crack epidemic of the 1980s and the rise of more violent drug organizations made Lucas's era seem almost quaint by comparison. His stories of gentleman criminal behavior and business-like drug operations appealed to people who were looking for a more civilized version of criminal enterprise, even if that version had never actually existed. The media environment of the late 20th century also worked in Lucas's favor. Journalists were often more interested in compelling narratives than rigorous fact-checking, especially when dealing with historical criminal cases that seemed to have little contemporary relevance. The idea of investigating decades-old claims about drug-dealing operations seemed less urgent than covering current events, allowing Lucas's mythology to spread largely unchallenged through popular culture. When American Gangster hit theaters in 2007, it carried the weight of authenticity that only comes with that magic phrase, based on a true story. But what audiences witnessed wasn't just Hollywood taking creative liberties with historical events. This was something far more insidious, the complete transformation of a street-level dealer into a criminal mastermind, orchestrated not by screenwriters, but by Frank Lucas himself. The film's portrayal of Lucas as a revolutionary figure who single-handedly disrupted the established drug trade wasn't born in writers' rooms or studio boardrooms. It emerged from Lucas's own carefully constructed mythology, refined over decades of interviews, conversations, and public appearances. He had become the primary source for his own legend, and Hollywood simply amplified what he had already been selling. Consider the central premise that drove the entire narrative. Lucas claimed he had identified a fundamental flaw in the traditional drug distribution system, where multiple middlemen inflated prices and diluted product quality. According to his version of events, he solved this problem through vertical integration, establishing direct relationships with Southeast Asian suppliers and cutting out every intermediary between poppy fields and street corners. This wasn't just criminal innovation, it was business school case study material wrapped in illegal packaging. Lucas presented himself as the Henry Ford of heroin distribution, revolutionizing an entire industry through superior logistics and quality control. The story was so compelling because it applied legitimate business principles to criminal enterprises, creating a narrative that was simultaneously transgressive and familiar. But here's where Lucas's genius as a mythmaker becomes apparent. He didn't just claim to have been successful, he claimed to have been successful in ways that validated American cultural values about innovation, entrepreneurship, and individual achievement. His story wasn't really about drug dealing, it was about disrupting established industries through superior methods and relentless execution. The coffin smuggling operation became the perfect symbol of this supposed innovation. Not only did it explain how Lucas had achieved his direct Asian connection, but it also provided a viscerally shocking detail that guaranteed his story would be memorable. The image of heroin hidden among the bodies of fallen American soldiers was so outrageous, so morally repugnant, that it had to be true. Who would fabricate something so horrific? Frank Lucas, apparently, because when investigators actually examined this central claim, they found no evidence that any such operation had ever existed. Military protocols for handling war dead were extensive and carefully monitored, making the kind of systematic smuggling Lucas described virtually impossible. More importantly, no heroin seizures, arrest records, or intelligence reports from the relevant time period mention anything resembling the operation Lucas claimed to have masterminded. The absence of evidence becomes even more significant when you consider how thoroughly the Vietnam War era has been investigated and documented. If American military personnel had been systematically involved in smuggling operations using fallen soldiers as cover, it would have represented one of the most shocking scandals in military history. Yet despite decades of investigation into military corruption, war profiteering, and drug trafficking during the Vietnam conflict, no credible evidence of Lucas's coffin network has ever emerged. This pattern of unsupported claims extends throughout Lucas's mythology. His supposed cousin in the military, the key figure who allegedly facilitated the entire smuggling operation, remains a phantom. Despite extensive efforts by journalists and investigators, no one has ever identified this crucial accomplice or found any military records that would support his existence in the role Lucas described. The financial aspects of Lucas's claimed empire prove equally problematic under scrutiny. Running the kind of international smuggling operation depicted in American Gangster would have required massive capital investments, sophisticated money laundering systems, and extensive legitimate business fronts to explain the source of his wealth. Yet when law enforcement actually investigated Lucas's finances, they found none of these elements. His arrest and prosecution records tell a much different story than the one portrayed in the film. Rather than seizing millions in cash, dozens of properties and evidence of complex financial operations, authorities found assets consistent with a successful but hardly revolutionary street-level dealer. The gap between Lucas's claims and the actual evidence was enormous, but by the time anyone bothered to examine the discrepancy seriously, his mythology had already taken root in popular culture. What makes Lucas's deception particularly effective is how he embedded genuine criminal activity within his fabricated narrative. He really did deal drugs in Harlem during the early 1970s. He really was involved in violence and corruption. He really did get arrested and prosecuted. These verifiable facts provided credibility for the more elaborate claims that surrounded them. This technique of mixing truth with fiction is a classic method of effective deception. By admitting to serious crimes that could be independently verified, Lucas established himself as a credible source for the more sensational claims that couldn't be easily checked. After all, if he was willing to confess to murder and drug trafficking, why would he lie about smuggling methods or distribution networks? The cultural moment when Lucas's story gained prominence also worked in his favour. The 1980s and 1990s saw a growing fascination with criminal entrepreneurship, driven partly by the crack epidemic and the rise of more violent drug organisations. Against this backdrop, Lucas's claims about gentleman criminal behaviour and business-like drug operations seemed almost quaint, even admirable by comparison. Media coverage during this period often treated organised crime figures as fascinating case studies rather than dangerous criminals. The romanticisation of mob bosses, drug kingpins, and other criminal figures had become a staple of American popular culture, creating an environment where Lucas's self-mythology could flourish without serious challenge. Hollywood's eventual embrace of the Lucas story was almost inevitable. The film industry had long been drawn to narratives about criminal innovation and entrepreneurship, from the bootleggers of Prohibition to the bank robbers of the Depression era. Lucas offered something even better, a contemporary criminal whose story seemed to encapsulate broader themes about American society, race relations, and economic inequality. The casting of Denzel Washington as Lucas was particularly significant. Washington brought gravitas and legitimacy to the role that helped audiences accept the character's more outrageous claims. His performance suggested depth and complexity that elevated Lucas from simple criminal to tragic anti-hero, a man whose talents might have made him successful in legitimate business if circumstances had been different. But this sympathetic portrayal obscured the real damage that Lucas and dealers like him inflicted on their communities. While the film focused on Lucas's supposed business acumen and family loyalty, it largely ignored the human cost of heroin addiction in Harlem during the 1970s. The real story wasn't about criminal innovation. It was about the devastating impact of drugs on already vulnerable communities. The neighborhoods where Lucas actually operated tell a much different story than the one depicted in American Gangster. Rather than being respected as a successful businessman who happened to work outside the law, contemporary accounts suggest that Lucas was viewed by many residents as part of the problem destroying their community. The glamorous lifestyle portrayed in the film stood in stark contrast to the reality of addiction, violence, and despair that characterized the heroin trade. This disconnect between Lucas's mythology and the actual impact of his activities reveals something crucial about how we construct narratives around criminal figures. By focusing on supposed innovation and entrepreneurship, we often lose sight of the human consequences of illegal activities. The transformation of Frank Lucas from street-level dealer to folk hero required ignoring the voices of his actual victims and the communities most affected by his crimes. The persistence of Lucas's mythology, even in the face of contradictory evidence, demonstrates the power of compelling storytelling over factual accuracy. Once his narrative became established in popular culture, it developed a momentum that made it resistant to correction or qualification. The story was simply too good, too perfectly constructed, to be abandoned merely because it wasn't true. This dynamic reveals something troubling about how we process information in an entertainment-driven media environment. The most memorable stories aren't necessarily the most accurate ones, and the figures who capture our imagination aren't always the ones who deserve our attention. Frank Lucas succeeded in transforming himself from a minor criminal into a cultural icon not through his actual achievements, but through his skills as a narrator of his own fictional biography. The real question isn't whether Hollywood should have fact-checked Lucas's claims more thoroughly before making American Gangster. The more important issue is why we're so drawn to stories that celebrate criminal innovation and entrepreneurship, even when those stories cause real harm to the communities most affected by the activities they romanticize. The Frank Lucas mythology didn't just distort one man's criminal record. It fundamentally altered how we understand the heroin epidemic that devastated American cities during the 1970s. By positioning Lucas as the mastermind behind Harlem's drug trade, his narrative obscured the real forces that were driving addiction and violence in urban communities across the nation. The truth is far more complex and far less flattering to American institutions than Lucas's story suggests. The heroin epidemic of the 1970s wasn't created by innovative criminal entrepreneurs cutting out middlemen and improving product quality. It was the result of systematic failures in healthcare, education, economic opportunity, and social support systems that left entire communities vulnerable to the ravages of addiction. While Lucas was spinning tales about his revolutionary distribution networks, the real factors driving heroin use were poverty, lack of opportunity, inadequate mental health resources, and the social disruption caused by urban renewal policies that destroyed stable neighborhoods. These weren't problems that could be solved by arresting one supposed kingpin, no matter how legendary his methods might have been. The communities most affected by heroin addiction during this period weren't looking for criminal innovators to admire. They were struggling with the daily reality of addiction, violence, and economic desperation. The romanticization of figures like Lucas actively undermined efforts to address these root causes by suggesting that the drug trade was primarily about individual criminal genius rather than systemic social problems. This misunderstanding has had lasting consequences for how we approach drug policy and criminal justice. When we celebrate criminals as entrepreneurs and innovators, we implicitly accept the premise that illegal drug markets operate according to normal business principles. This leads to enforcement strategies focused on disrupting supposed criminal enterprises rather than addressing the demand-side factors that actually drive drug use. The DEA agents who actually worked cases during Lucas's era consistently report that removing individual dealers, even successful ones, had minimal impact on overall drug availability or pricing. The heroin trade was resilient, not because it was controlled by criminal masterminds, but because it was driven by underlying social and economic forces that created steady demand for illegal substances. Lucas's mythology also distorted public understanding of how organised crime actually operated during the 1970s. Rather than being dominated by innovative outsiders who disrupted established systems, the drug trade was largely controlled by the same criminal organisations that had been operating for decades. These groups didn't need to revolutionise anything because their existing methods were already highly effective. The Italian-American crime families that Lucas claimed to have outmaneuvered were actually adapting quite successfully to changing market conditions during this period. They had extensive experience with illegal importation, sophisticated money laundering operations, and established relationships with corrupt officials. The idea that a single individual could have successfully challenged these entrenched interests without significant institutional support simply doesn't align with what we know about how organised crime actually functions. More problematically, Lucas's story reinforced harmful stereotypes about urban crime and drug dealing. By presenting himself as an exceptional figure who rose above his circumstances through superior intelligence and business acumen, he implicitly suggested that other dealers were simply less talented or ambitious. This narrative ignored the reality that most people involved in street-level drug dealing were driven by desperation, addiction, or lack of legitimate opportunities rather than entrepreneurial ambition. The persistence of Lucas's mythology reveals something disturbing about American culture's relationship with criminal figures. We seem drawn to stories that transform lawbreakers into folk heroes, especially when those stories validate our beliefs about individual achievement and market innovation. This tendency becomes particularly problematic when it involves activities that cause measurable harm to vulnerable communities. The real Frank Lucas died in 2019, taking with him any remaining possibility of a full accounting of his actual criminal activities versus his fabricated mythology. But his legacy lives on in American Gangster and countless other cultural products that continue to present his version of events as historical fact. Each new generation encounters his story through entertainment media rather than rigorous historical investigation, ensuring that the mythology remains more influential than the truth. This dynamic illustrates a broader problem with how we consume historical narratives in an entertainment-driven media environment. When compelling stories compete with factual accuracy, the stories usually win. We prefer narratives that confirm our existing beliefs and expectations over evidence that challenges our assumptions, even when those assumptions cause real harm. The Frank Lucas case should serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting criminal self-mythology at face value. But more importantly, it should prompt us to examine why we're so eager to believe stories that celebrate illegal activities, especially when those activities devastate the communities we claim to care about. The real tragedy isn't that Frank Lucas lied about his criminal career, it's that his lies became more influential than the truth shaping public understanding of urban crime, drug policy, and criminal justice in ways that continue to cause harm decades later. When we transform dealers into entrepreneurs and criminals into folk heroes, we're not just distorting history. We're actively undermining efforts to address the real problems that make communities vulnerable to the activities we're romanticizing. The next time you encounter a story about criminal innovation or entrepreneurship, remember Frank Lucas. Ask yourself whether the narrative you're hearing serves the interests of the people most affected by the activities being described, or whether it primarily serves the interests of the person telling the story. Because in the end, the most dangerous lies aren't always the obvious ones. Sometimes they're the lies that sound just true enough to make us forget who's really paying the price. Frank Lucas understood something crucial about American culture. We love stories about underdogs who beat the system through superior intelligence and determination. He gave us exactly what we wanted to hear, wrapped in just enough genuine criminality to seem authentic. The fact that none of it was true didn't matter, because the truth was never really the point. The point was the story itself, and Frank Lucas was nothing if not a master storyteller. The real question now is whether we're willing to learn from his deception, or whether we'll continue to prefer compelling fiction over complicated reality. Because somewhere out there, another Frank Lucas is crafting another mythology, and we're probably already eager to believe it.